Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Today we're on to episode 133. We're talking about our featured species, Nara, and some stuff. Frankly, I've got, some questions that I needed to get to, things that I want to address, and I want to make sure that my inbox doesn't build up too much. So as usual, thank you everybody for tuning in and either watching on YouTube or listening as a traditional audio podcast, wherever you're getting your podcasts, it can be found. I really want to say thank you. I had a large number of people who decided to support the show over the last couple of weeks. Those folks went to patreon.com/lumberupdate and supported the show there. Every little bit is a really beneficial help to the show. Too many words there. But quite a few of you also joined at that walnut tier, and you will be getting handy dandy super fancy stickers like this one that we're talking about Nara this week. So again, thank you for supporting the show, but also thank you to everybody who's been sending in questions. Like I said, one of the reasons I want to include questions on this show instead of just talking about Nara today is because I've gotten a lot of them lately. And I really, really appreciate that. I shape the direction of the show based on the questions that you guys send in, even the suggestions that you guys send in. The number of people who've asked me about figured woods, that's what's really spawning this whole series about figured woods. So go to lumberupdate.com, fill out the form to submit your question there, or just email me, lumberupdate@gmail.com, or look me up on Instagram at lumberupdateshow, and you can ask questions there. In fact, a couple of the questions from this week have come directly from Instagram. Enough of that business. I've been talking about figured material, and last week I specifically talked about burls, and I had this little piece of birch burl that was sitting on my bench, and I forgot to show it off, and I kind of wanted to hit on it simply because it shows just how small they can be. We hear about burls being these massive, gigantic type things that you can make whole tables and things out of. A lot of times they're just a tiny little growth on a tree. This was actually a tree that came down in my neighborhood, and by the time I knew about it, it had already been bucked into pieces. And this was literally about as long as the piece was. It was turned into firewood, and I grabbed it and I sawed it into boards. This is probably 15 years ago. I think this is the last piece I have of this burl, and I was able to use this little section of burl on a number of turnings, a number of small boxes. There was kind of further out in the stack, I made a pin blank out of it. So it's just another example of burls can kind of be found in any number of places. And in fact, go out to your firewood pile, and you might be surprised how many hunks of firewood have a tiny little burl on it. They can be just really small things. But it also brought up something, and I had several questions after the show about burls versus cankers. And I'll be honest, I didn't immediately have an answer to this because I've seen cankers on trees. Walnuts right now are being infected and affected by something called thousand canker disease. And it's kind of serious for the walnut market. But I dug up kind of a technical definition. And I think the real difference is the appearance of the growth on the tree. So a tree canker is a plant disease caused by bacteria and fungi that affects wounded or stressed trees. Cankers appear as sunken, swollen, those seem contrary, sunken, swollen, cracked, or dead areas on the trunk, branches, or twigs. They can weaken a tree's structure and create entry points for disease and insects. Pruning the affected limbs nearby is the only remedy. A tree burl, on the other hand, grows in a tree's trunk or branches as a result of stress or injury. We talked about this last week. Burls are characterized by their irregular shape and intricate patterns and are often described as looking at bumps or warts. They are typically rounded or horizontally ridged with no protruding limbs or twigs. Burls are not diseased nor contagious, and they can even help protect the tree from further damage. And we talked about this last week, whereas you don't want to cut the burl off because you're actually probably going to kill the tree because you've created a huge wound in it. But at the same time, the burl is not hurting the tree. And I Googled a bunch of images, and yeah, cankers just look bad. Sunken cracked, dry, dead is very indicative of what you might find. I think the other thing that you'll find with a burl is while it is a wart, while it is a bump growing in the outside of the tree, you won't find it broken. The outer bark is in place. Now, it may look kind of irregular, but it's not splitting and cracking and exposing the inner parts of the tree to infection. Whereas a canker is going to have splitting bark and cracked bark, and it is generally an ingress point for bacteria and fungus to get into the tree. The burl is essentially a reaction to something, right? And it's caused irregular growth, which is sealed over that area of stress. Whereas the canker is an open wound. That's probably the best metaphor, as gross as it may sound. A canker is actually an open, bleeding wound, whereas a burl is, well, it's a wart. It's sealed over, and it's not allowing infection into the tree. So, do a fair bit of Google image search, and you'll find a lot of examples of cankers, and you're like, is that a burl or is that a canker? And I think it's a canker because Google tells me it's a canker. It's not, well, forgive the lumber pun, it's not as cut and dried as you might think. But I think what you do, if you find something on a tree and you can't determine if it's a burl or a canker, look further in the tree. Look at the leaves. There will be evidence of the tree being under stress. You'll find brown spots on the leaves. You'll find peeling bark. You'll find lots of the tree branching out in a lot of areas. The tree is branching out, throwing out shoots as a way to get more nutrients, more chlorophyll, more energy coming in order to fight off the infection. It's shooting out those little shoots, and it's the same thing as like your mom telling you to drink orange juice. Generally, the tree itself will look stressed. That's really the big difference between a canker and a burl. Thank you for, Lord knows, the 10, 20 people that actually wrote in who had that question, because it certainly wasn't something that I knew right away. Anyway, let's move on to some stuff in the news. I featured these guys. Can't remember the name of this. There is a Japanese show. Now I'm forgetting the name of the show. If I were to circle back and play this again, it would tell me that. But I talked about this probably 10, 12 episodes ago, and someone sent me a link to this gentleman who is a tree doctor, tree surgeon, tree carer in Hiroshima, Japan. And he specifically, his entire mandate is to care for the A-bomb surviving trees. This was particularly interesting for me. It was quite poignant because they interviewed on the show, and for those watching the video, well, actually, if you're listening or watching this, I will post a link to this video. It is well worth checking it out. I actually found, let's see, it's about a 30-minute segment, and it was quite interesting. Mainly just understanding how a tree surgeon does his work. What kind of triage is done? How do they care for these ailing trees? But this was interesting. There are still 159 surviving trees in Hiroshima that were there during the drop of the atomic bomb. Most of these trees lean towards ground zero because of the growth on the side of the tree towards ground zero. It was heat damaged, and that growth has been stunted. So it's growing slower than the side away from it. So the side away from it is growing faster, causing the whole tree to lean towards ground zero. And without fail, every one of these surviving trees has a lean. And no matter where you are in the city, you can point to ground zero by looking at those surviving trees. The other thing is the bark on the ground zero side is very scaly. It was damaged by the heat. And you can actually see a line running, vertically down the trunk that shows where the heat blast hit the tree. And it's truly amazing. Actually, on the video right now, you're seeing old footage compared to new footage. And they showed, in many instances, they had footage of one of the trees before the bomb was dropped. And they were able to get the exact same footage, the exact same angle, everything of the tree today. And these trees, I don't want to say they're flourishing because they are quite old. Most of them are at the end of their life, even if they didn't have an atomic bomb drop near them. But it's a testament to life moving on. In the story, when they interview several Hiroshima survivors or sons and daughters of parents who lived through it, and they tell stories about how the people of Hiroshima drew strength from these trees that they grew up playing under and that they were still there. So this guy, it's amazing. I think he's in his mid 70s now. And for most of his professional life, almost all of his professional life, this has been his job, keeping these trees alive. Um, such a cool story, and really shocking that so many trees survived something like an atomic blast. Really, I was very blown away. So I think it was Jay that sent this to me. Jay, thank you for sending that my way. Next is a fun little story that I found on Instagram, specifically Broadleaf Tree Care. They're Broadleaf Tree Care NZ. So if you hadn't figured it out, they're in New Zealand. Well, what I found interesting was a post where they are using an Alaskan mill to saw a log into planks. No big deal. Lots of people have seen Alaskan mills. If you don't know what an Alaskan mill is, it's a chainsaw. And I'm playing the video here on the video feed. But what's interesting is they use the Alaskan mill to saw a standing tree into slabs. So this is a particularly enormous tree. Is it a quarry tree? I don't think it's a quarry tree. They do say I don't know that it says in this particular video. Well, they do say redwood, but is a redwood in New Zealand the same as a redwood in North America? I don't think so. Doesn't really matter. It's a big tree. And apparently the owner or someone said, I want to use this for lumber. I want to say it was 72 inches around. It's big. Not around, across. It's a really, really big tree, really, really big slabs. And the smartest way, most efficient way to do this was to top the tree and then run the Alaskan mill vertically. There are further videos in this on this Instagram channel where they show how they actually take the slabs down. So they cut it vertically, and then they come in with a chainsaw at the base and using a crane, basically just cut it right off at the bottom and separate that slab and bring it away. This entire tree removal is actually chronicled on this Instagram page over a number of posts. It's somewhere in these posts it tells why they're doing it this way, what the actual species is. Ultimately, it just comes down to they're probably not able to drop a tree this size without causing significant damage. As that tree fell, it would probably shatter itself because it's so large. And depending on the species, it could very well be prone to breaking apart. If it actually is a redwood, that's highly possible. So this was just a really interesting solution. I've never seen this done before, and I'd love to hear from anyone out there who might know, do people do this? Is this a way of felling a tree? Now, you must have to have a crane, but I imagine if you're going to tackle a tree of this size, you're probably going to need to have a crane anyway. And I imagine it's a heck of a lot slower, therefore a lot more expensive. So there would have to be a very strong reason to do this. But I did find it particularly cool as a way to just saw it right into planks while it's standing there, cutting it off at the base and pulling out a slab out one at a time. If nothing else, gravity is helping move that Alaskan mill down the face of that log, which is just a really cool story. And Broadleaf Tree Care NZ, at Broadleaf Tree Care NZ. Really, really cool channel. If you don't follow them, you should, because there's some really gratuitous tree sawing going on there. All right, so let's move on to my main topic, which is my featured species, Nara. Last episode, I talked about Burls. I briefly mentioned Amboyna Burl, but I kind of quickly jumped away from it because I knew that in the next episode I would be talking about it. So in my hand is a small block of Amboyna Burl. Well, that's what the burl is called, and very much like Tamo ash, when it's in its figured form, it's called one thing. When it's just a plain old ordinary straight grained, it's called something else, in which case Nara. That's Pterocarpus indicus is the botanical name, and Nara, well, first of all, if you know your Latin botanicals, Pterocarpus is the genus that Padauk is in. And you might look at Nara and think that looks a lot like Padauk. I think it looks kind of like Padauk and Bubinga got together and, you know what I mean, and produced Nara. Is that tree porn? I guess that's tree porn. Nara, in its regular, unfigured, kind of straight grain nature, is It's Padauk without all the orange. Frankly, I'm not a real fan of Padauk. I think it's way too orange and garish. Nara is a lot more understated. And again, you'll find there's a lot of similarities to color-wise to Bubinga. It's red with like a bit of purple in it. But Nara, I find, has a more cooperative grain than Bubinga. Nara is most often sold as Amboyna Burl. And it's called Amboyna Burl because it's found in a lot of places in Southeast Asia, but it really gained popularity from the trees on the island of Ambon, which is in and around the Banda Sea in that area. And, you'll find Amboyna Burl primarily in things like pin blanks. Here's a great 3/4 inch pin blank. Here's another pin blank. Well, let me just throw that right there. But you'll also find it in straight grain pieces, and it'll be sold as Nara, which is what this piece is, and this other small, plank that I was showing you earlier. Another one that looks like this, a little bit of sapwood visible. The sapwood is nice and creamy white. Nara is certainly a tropical tree. But here's the interesting part about it. I've worked with it a fair bit. It is a tree that is prone to figure, not just the burl that we've seen the Amboyna, but I think you'll find a lot of the Nara, and that's just how I'm going to refer to it from now on. When I'm saying Nara, I'm referring to unfigured. If it's burl, I'm going to call it Amboyna, and that's pretty much how the commercial market treats it as well. But Nara is one of those species that is just genetically predisposed to figure. Now, if you're watching the video, I don't know if I can really pick it up in the light, but there's a tiny bit of curl, I might even call it quilting, in this Nara. And that's very typical with at least all of the Nara that I've worked with. And it's not been a lot, I'll be honest. The largest Nara board I've ever gotten is probably been about 36 inches long. I mostly have bought like pool cue blanks, or peppermill blanks, whatever you want to call them. I bought smaller blocks of it for, pin turning, knife scales, things like that. That's really the only time that I've sought it out is in smaller already S4S type products. But I've gotten, that 136-inch board, which is actually what this little plank, this is all that's left of that, came from. And what I found really interesting, even in the Amboyna Burl format, it's actually surprisingly easy to work with. Here's a square that I made that uses an Amboyna inlay in it, little diamond inlay. And that's generally how I've used Nara, is small accent pieces, a lid to a box or something like that. And Amboyna, I'm, rashing it off. I've had this block of Amboyna was about twice as long as it is. So originally it was about 8 inches long. And I have been slicing little pieces off of it for, drawer handles and inlays like in this square and lids on small turn boxes and things like that for 10 years or so. What I find truly interesting, and I want to dive into the technical specs here, is Nara, although it is a tropical Southeast Asian species, and it is in the Pterocarpus genus, and if you worked with anything in the Pterocarpus genus, like Padauk, you'll know that it is a nightmare, an absolute nightmare to work. Interlocked, twisty, kind of stringy, rowy grain that tears at it if you look at it funny. Nara doesn't. Nara's hardness is only 1260, which is actually significantly less. Well, I should say significantly. I find that hardness is kind of exponential. The difference between 1,000 hardness and 1,200 hardness is much smaller than the difference between 1,200 and 1,400. And it's not, scientifically speaking, it's not. It is a linear hardness thing. But I just find that when it comes to working it, once you start getting above 1,200 and 1,500 and certainly into the 25s and 3,500s, the hardness is just ridiculous, and it's so hard to work with. That 1260 makes it very similar to white oak. I think white oak is 1250. And again, you can't really give it a number. The numbers are averages. They're always going to be a range. In my experience, Nara works easier than that 1200 hardness says. Movement-wise, it's relatively stable. Tangential is about 4%, quite low. Radial is 2.8, which is actually a little bit high for some radial numbers, but it's got a TR ratio of 1.4, so it's a pretty stable wood. Density 0.54, so it's kind of up there where you would expect. But if you look at other woods in that 1200 to 1300 range, you'll find that the density is a couple points lower than that. And this is why. It is, unlike a lot of tropical woods that are heavy, dense, and diffuse porous, Narra is a semi-ring porous wood. It's got kind of solitary pores scattered all over the place of all kinds of different sizes. Each one's going to be a little bit different size, and they can be large down to about as small as like a medium-sized pore. They're not tiny, tiny, tiny little pores like you would find in, beech or maple or something. These pores that are larger but scattered enough that there's enough meat in between, but those larger pores do reduce its density, and I find that it gives the wood a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of buffer space. So as you're planing it, as you're chopping it, there's a little bit of give to the wood. There's that little bit of flex that it can fill in those empty spots, and the whole thing is just a lot easier to work with. It's a somewhat oily wood, so there's a bit of self-lubrication as you're planing it. But when I look at the modulus of rupture is 13, just under 14,000. Modulus of elasticity, about 1.7 million. Those numbers are lower than many of the other species you're going to find with a similar density and a similar hardness. And it's this kind of lack of structure, if you will, that makes it a lot easier to work than you might think based on its geographic origin and based upon that somewhat, predisposed figured grain. In other words, if figured woods scare you off because they're harder to work and they tear out, Nara, or even its Burl component, Amboyna, could be a great solution for you. I've worked a lot of Amboyna Burl, and I found it very pleasant to work with. Now, you got to have sharp blades with a hand plane. You got to skew your cut all the time. But the regular straight grain stuff, even if it's got a bit of quilting to it, can be absolutely wonderful to work. It helps the whole situation that the entire wood has a rose scent to it. So as you're planing, it's like you've got potpourri in your shop. It's a lovely experience. The burls are certainly highly sought after and are harvested sustainably in the fact that they're almost entirely harvested for veneer, or what's left over are small turning blanks like I have in my hand. Mainly because it was an irregular piece of the burl. They sawed the veneer off and they had this little chunk left over, and they sawed it into a small turning blank, or an offcut or a bowl blank or something like that. The normal growth is very often used in typical flat woodworking, cabinetry, and things like that, but it's not heavily sought after, so it is rarely exported from Southeast Asia. In other words, it stays in country, and it's become kind of the poplar of Southeast Asia. That's probably a bit too far of a reach, but it's, your typical, forgive the pun, run-of-the-mill domestic lumber that we have in North America or wherever you are in the world. That could be any number of species. You probably can find them at your local big box store. Nara could be found at the local big box store. In fact, I've got a couple contacts in Indonesia and Java, and I reached out to him via email the last couple of weeks, and I said, if you were to go, I don't really have a lot of big box stores, but if you were to go to your local non-lumber yard place to buy lumber, like your hardware store, what would you find? Would you find Nara? And maybe it was a bit of a leading question, but both of them responded, yes, I would find Nara on the shelves, already S4S, and ready for home improvement type projects. Sounds a lot like going to Lowe's, Home Depot, or Menards here in North America. So it is that species that nobody bothers to export it because there's not enough of a demand for it, but it grows everywhere, all across Southeast Asia, and it's a great wood for cabinetry, so it just pretty much stays in country. It's what we refer to as a tertiary species. You've got your primary species that everybody's searching for, and if it grows in your region, you probably can't get access to it. All you folks up at British Columbia who can't get Douglas fir, you know what I'm talking about, because all your Doug fir is shipped somewhere else. All the folks in the Ohio River Valley who can't get any walnut or cherry because it's all going somewhere else. This is what Nara is like. The secondary species are kind of filling in the gaps because maybe it's a little bit harder to get. There's too much pressure, whether sustainable or unsustainable on that primary species. The secondary is kind of coming into the market and starting to get exported more. The tertiary species, most people have never heard of it. The good news about Nara is people have heard of Amboyna Burl, and people are harvesting Amboyna Burl. And as we know, you can't just cut a burl off a tree and expect the tree to live and go on fine. So they're cutting down the whole tree, which means if you have Amboyna Burl, you've got Nara. And if there's a market for Amboyna, somebody's cutting down the Nara and sawing it into boards. And those who are importing and are savvy about it are not just importing, a single species. If they are, they're getting more of a grab bag through a broker. They're not really getting quality assurance on the whole thing. So what they're trying to do is buy as much of the material that the sawmill has, and that's where Nara is starting to kind of, quote unquote, accidentally be imported into other countries, like where I am in North America, or you'll find it in Europe at this point now too. So it's not impossible to get. A little bit of Google searching will find Nara. Now, you're not going to find huge planks of this stuff. You might get lucky. You might find, something that this image that I'm showing you in the video is a great shot taken from Cook Woods up in Oregon. They have a couple of pieces of it. Even those pieces have kind of an historical story behind them that they talk about on their website. Normally, what you're going to find are your typical pepper mill pool cue blank. And I draw a distinction between them because pepper mill blanks tend to be a little bit more boring figure, whereas pool cue blanks tend to have a lot more exciting figure. Pool cues are very kind of showy pieces, ornamental. You'll find snakewood and quilted Nara and things like that being used. The image that I'm showing on screen actually came from Bell Forest. They sell quite a few of pool cue blanks. Or you might just get it in the Amboyna Burl format. Certainly, if you look up Amboyna Burl, you will find a lot of people selling bowl blanks and things like that. Look a little bit deeper on that same site, and you might be not surprised that they'll have some Nara for you as well. I highly recommend getting your hands on some of this stuff. The scent alone is worth working it, but frankly, it's just, well, yeah, like I said earlier, it's a great foray into a great tropical wood that's not going to be super, super hard to work with. Bubinga is a beautiful wood, but holy crap, is it hard to work with. It's extremely hard. Tears out a lot. Padauk, same thing. Plus, Padauk gets orange dust all over everything, on your fingernails, all over everything, everywhere. So I urge you to consider it next time you're shopping for something exotic, and give Nara a try. Now, if you can't find it, what are we looking for? Well, certainly it's in the same genus. Padauk is a possible alternative. As I've already said, I'm not a real big fan of Padauk, so maybe not. Macquarie, however, a little bit more orange, and Macquarie is a little bit more open grain, but similar, and often you'll find it within the same geographic distribution. Macquarie would be one of those secondary species that I was talking about before, a secondary to the mahogany market. And I say mahogany in the most generic term possible. Now, Nara, a lot of Nara grows in the Philippines. In fact, it is the national tree of the Philippines. And because of that, you'll find that one of the great alternatives to Nara is Philippine mahogany. Now, Philippine mahogany is in the Sharia genus. Some folks may have heard of it as Luan. You go to your big box store and you find Luan plywood. That is a Sharia genus. That is technically a Philippine mahogany. Familiar with Chris-Craft boats? They generally used Philippine mahogany. Nara, not really filling that gap as a tertiary species because it's probably a little bit too heavy for that. But, if you can find Sharia, anything in the Sharia genus is going to be a possible alternative. Another alternative could just be good old-fashioned sapele, something that we've featured on this show before. The other thing that I like about Nara, is kind of the last thing I'll say, is it has a fairly high luster. So again, on the video, I've got a piece of Amboyna Burl. This has lacquer just to kind of seal it. The other face doesn't have it, but you could sand this really high grit sandpaper, 800, 600, 800 grit sandpaper, and you can bring up a really high luster. This is typical of a lot of these jungle woods that have a high oil content, but not so high that it gets kind of gummy. Teak is a good example of something that's really, really oily. And if you sand it, it will certainly get smooth and it always feels oily, but it will never get a luster because the oil is so high that the sanding dust kind of turns into a powder and covers the surface. Ebony, Macassar ebony, Nara, a couple of other species, several of the rosewoods have that just the right oil content that as you sand it, it's dry enough that the dust goes away, but you can bring up a really, really high luster without any finish whatsoever, just through good old-fashioned sanding. And if you take Nara and put it on a lathe and just friction polish it with its own shavings or something like a brown paper bag, you will be amazed at the mirror polish you can get on this wood. Those high luster woods are also, I think, indicative of a wood that is somewhat easier to work. Anybody who's worked with ebony knows that it's incredibly hard, but it is still easier to work than its hardness belies. Take a wood of similar hardness without that kind of waxy luster, and you will struggle to work it. And it's funny, I'm referring to ebony as easy to work. Anybody who's worked with ebony does not think easy to work. It's the first thing that comes to mind. But compared to other woods of the same kind of technical data, you'd be surprised. And this is Nara again. That somewhat high luster affects its workability, and it makes it really, really a pleasure to work with. Enough of that. That's Nara. I've had some great experience with it. I hope that you will get a chance to try it out as well. And those of you who are interested in that sticker, well, that is the species of the month for September. And if you become a Walnut Tier subscriber anytime in the month of September, you will get that sticker mailed out to you. In fact, I should be dropping some of those in the mail tomorrow. Moving on to questions. This is from Sergio. He said, I have one question regarding choosing lumber widths for outdoor tables. I'm building a mahogany 8-quarter table that's 30 inches by 80 inches. Do you prefer boards in the 4, 6, or 6-inch plus width range? This table will be out of the elements most of the day. So what he's getting at is what's going to behave better, a wider board or a narrow board outside. If it's out of the elements, that's one thing. If it's going to be exposed to rainwater, first of all, you need to absolutely make sure that it's not a solid table, that it's got slats, places for water to run off and go through the table. And if it's a solid slab, you got to have a cant to it so water runs off. You don't want water sitting or standing on top of that table. That's why outdoor tables generally have slats. The few outdoor tables I've seen lately that don't have slats have a slight camber to them so they roll off. They also tend to be really, really thick slabs as well. In other words, the extra thickness is just a little bit of extra oomph to keep the board from doing crazy things if water stands on it for a while and it cups. So a wider board is going to allow for more possibility of standing water. That's something to be concerned about. He says this is going to be out of the elements. I don't know what he says most of the day. I don't really know what that means. Under a porch roof, I'm guessing. So I'm guessing it's not getting any water. Sunshine, certainly, the wider the surface exposed to the board, the more uneven heating. That wider face is getting sun baking down, shade underneath. You're going to get a differential in movement. But you know what? That's going to happen on a 4-inch board as much as a 6-inch board. Wood movement is a percentage game. So a 6-inch board, 6% of 6 inches is larger than 6% of 4 inches if your movement is 6%. So technically, you'll be more stable using a narrower board. But here's the thing. That's an absolutism, and I'm really hesitant to say that. If you've tackled your water runoff issue, ultimately, the width of the board shouldn't matter if you construct your table appropriately. If you engineer your joinery so that the boards are restrained but not restricted from moving, you'll be just fine. So if you have a wider board, we'll just go, say you're building a tabletop that has slats, and you go with 4-inch slats. You could probably attach each one of those boards through, horizontal braces underneath in the center of that 4-inch board, and you might be okay. A 6-inch board, if you attach, say, a screw through that center brace underneath into the center of that 6-inch board, you're probably going to get the edges of that 6-inch board to curl up. So what you want to do is attach that 6-inch boards at 2 points, probably 1 to 1.5 inches in from each edge to restrain the board and hold it flat. Now you're going to create slotted holes in that brace, so the screws will still slide in and out as the table expands and contracts. But the screws hold that board flat down to the brace, and it holds the entire board flat while allowing it to expand and contract. It restricts the movement, holds it flat, it restrains the movement, and holds it flat, but it does not restrict it and prevent it from expanding and contracting. And really, you go with a 10-inch board. Now, you're probably going to want to have 3 points of attachment to do that. And each one of those is going to have, a slotted hole that screw can move in and out in. Or you run a sliding dovetail socket underneath the entire thing, and you run a batten through, but you don't glue it, and you allow that tabletop to expand and contract, but the batten restrains it and holds it flat. And in that case, it doesn't matter how wide the board is. So I kind of answered the question by saying your safer bet is to go with a narrower board, but you're asking the wrong question. It's not the width of the board that I use. How should I construct the undercarriage of the table so that I can use a 6-inch board? And that's the question I'll throw back to you, Sergio. If that doesn't make sense, if you have questions, let me know. Moving on. Oh, I love this. This is from Ezra. He says, I have 2 local sources for walnut in Oregon. One has it shipped in from several places back east. I'm probably one of them. The other sources it locally. The place that sources it locally is 50% higher in price, although they frequently have a large selection with strong figure. Why such a big difference in price considering the shipping costs? So I don't want to laugh at shipping costs. Shipping costs have been higher than they've ever been, even higher than they were during COVID. It's crazy how much it costs to ship a container of lumber. It's crazy how much it costs to ship a single board of lumber. It's actually insane how much it costs to ship a single board of lumber. But when you weigh the cost of shipping an entire container versus shipping an entire board, it's almost negligible. So it's about bulk pricing. It's about shipping in bulk. It's about freight rates and being able to move, $100,000 worth of lumber in a container for $2,000. Let's be real, $12,000 in freight. Yes, it's 10% it's 12% of your total cost, but you still have that 88% margin to play with, plus whatever margin you put on top of from your cost to the sale price to be able to make money on that. The guy sourcing it locally, yes, it's not traveling as far. No, he's probably not paying as much in freight, but he's probably also not buying it in as large of quantity. The largest quantities of walnut are not coming from Oregon. They're coming from the Ohio River Valley, New York, upstate New York. They're coming from places east of the Mississippi. Now, walnut grows west of the Mississippi. Heck, you have your own varieties of walnut growing out on the West Coast. And that's probably attributes for some of the greater figure assortment that you're seeing in an Oregon lumberyard, because it might be, variations on Claro walnut, or just in general, the growing conditions out there make for slightly more figured woods. We'll get to that in a coming episode. I suspect that your local guy is sourcing locally. Kudos to him. That's awesome. But he's probably having to source it in smaller amounts, and therefore the freight is a larger percentage of what he's having to deal with. And because he's sourcing in smaller amounts, his cost is probably higher. It's just the fact of the nature. If you buy 12,000 board feet of something, you're going to get a better price per board foot than if you buy 200 board feet of something. There's probably 10, 12, 30 other reasons in that supply chain that are affecting the price. And actually, that's a really good point. The guy sourcing it locally may have 30 elements in his supply chain that affect his price. The guy sourcing it from a place out east maybe only has 5 elements in his supply chain that affect his price. And I'm being very generic. I'm saying elements. Elements could be the amount of lumber he bought, the grade of the lumber he bought, the quality, the dryness of the lumber, how far it came from, the person they bought it from. Did they, are they a sawmill or are they another lumber clear house? That could be it. Whereas the guy sourcing it locally may have 30, 40 different things that affect the cost of lumber. And it sounds ironic because it can come closer, yet have more things going on with it. That's going to vary from species to species to species. In this particular instance, if it is black walnut, Juglans nigra, it's just cheaper out east. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And if you're sourcing it locally, the cost from the guy who cut the tree down is going to be significantly higher than the cost to the guy who cut the black walnut down in the Appalachian wilderness. That's the walnut market. It is what it is. But good question. Very good question. There's a lot more than just freight that goes into how lumber is priced. I've actually got an article on my McIlvaine blog about how much was my lumber going to cost. And it talked about all the variables in that. I may actually link to that. Yeah, I will link to that in the show notes because I think it's worthwhile considering or being aware of all the factors that can affect the cost of your lumber. Last question I have today from Von Welch, a Patreon supporter. Thank you, Von Welch. I love your name. He says, thanks for highlighting urban forestry. As a homeowner with some big trees and a hobby woodworker, I'm curious how, when the day comes, I can most effectively feed my big trees into the urban forestry pipeline. Mainly, I just want to see them find a second life other than mulch or firewood. It would also be great if somehow in this process, I could get just a little bit of the tree back as lumber for a project to remember the tree. My sense from listening to your show is that there is no standard way. I'd have to call around to mills and arborists and try to find someone interested. Maybe different someone to take it down, someone to mill it up, then dry it, etc. So maybe I'm asking for some likely scenarios I might face. I recognize I'm not going to make any money off this. It will cost me. It's all about saving the tree. If you want an example tree for discussion, my oldest tree is a big, greater than 60-year-old oak. The house was built in 65, and I'm guessing it was either planted then or predates the house. So one of the reasons I love this question is he essentially already answered it in his question. Nice work. You can always tell a listener to the show because they lay everything out in this very specific order. Some of them even reference the episodes. I love you guys. That's great. You're just as much of a nerd as I am. That's definitely a prerequisite to listen to the show. There's got to be a certain amount of nerdery in there. So here's the thing. You're absolutely correct that it's probably going to be more than one person. You might get lucky. You guys remember when I had Sedmet Construction on, and we were talking about how he started as just a tree removal company, and then they bought a sawmill. I think a lot of tree removal companies are moving in that direction, and the tree removal companies that really specialize in residential, serving the homeowner, are moving quickly into the sawmill realm. The guys that are doing municipal, construction removal, things like that, they are just taking trees down. They don't care what happens to it because they're generally taking out tractor trailer loads full of logs. Now, I have a guest coming on a future episode that's going to talk about a source for those guys and a very cool circular economy thing that's going on. Little teaser for an upcoming episode. But for the most part, and in most cities in the United States, and I'd say even around the world, when you're taking down trees wholesale for expanding a highway, because Lord knows adding another lane to that 6-lane highway is going to certainly fix the bad traffic on it. When will people learn that it doesn't make a difference? There's just 6 lanes of bad traffic instead of 5 lanes of bad traffic. Those guys taking these trees down en masse, they've got to figure out what to do with hundreds of trunks. Whereas the residential arborist is 1 trunk at a time, maybe 2 from a house, maybe 3 or 4 in a day of work. But it's generally they're dealing with 1 trunk at a time. And they can afford to possibly take it back to their yard where they park their trucks and have a small log yard. And they can afford to have maybe a guy who just saws those up into boards and either sells them to people who have a lumber marketplace or sells them themselves. I think what people have discovered is, the margins on tree removal are very razor thin. I work with a guy who used to run a tree removal company, and the insurance alone was enough to make him decide, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to sell lumber. It is a tough business to make ends meet. So if you can find a way to increase the size of the pie, instead of taking that thing you took down that somebody paid you to take down and mulching it and getting nothing out of it, you could try to increase your value by selling that as lumber. Now that involves capital investment. It involves the investment of time, chainsaws, Alaskan mills, bandsaw mills, and just time. And you have to anticipate a slow turn rate. You can't just expect to saw that log and people are going to come rushing in and all the lumber is going to disappear. And go to Instagram and look at any of the guys that post there regularly, and you will see it's not a high margin industry. But for the tree removal guy, it's still something. It's something they weren't getting before. They were turning into mulch, which still took not the same amount of labor, but it took machinery in the chipper and it took time, and they basically sold it for pennies. Whereas now they can sell it for 5 pennies or maybe even $1 a board foot profit. And it is a continued use of that tree. Now, if they can tap into the right market and tap into that historical reclaim thing, then they might be getting $5 on the board foot in profit. So I do think that the best thing to do in order to give you the homeowner, the tree owner, if you will, to give you the best option is to try to find a guy that will not only take the tree down, but then has a sawmill. If he doesn't have a sawmill, the first thing you do is ask him, who do you know? He probably knows a guy because he's probably got logs that he doesn't know what to do with. And unless he's been hiding under a rock, knows that there's this urban forester thing, knows that rubber tire bandsaw mills are now cheaper, way cheaper than a car. And there's a lot of people buying them. So he probably knows somebody. He probably has a guy, in which case your tree removal guy and the sawmill guy are already connected. So your tree removal guy can take the tree down and transport the log to the sawmill guy. If it's two separate people, then you need to make sure the sawmill guy can come pick up the log, or you need to make sure that your tree removal guy will take the log to your sawmill guy, in which case, in either case, you're probably going to charge you more for that extra service. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. So the more links you can remove from that supply chain, the less you'll have to end up shelling out. The other thing that I would encourage you to think about when this happens is, what is your replanting scenario? You didn't ask this at all, and this is a bit tangential from your question, but if you're taking that tree down, what about the canopy? What kind of shade are you losing? I see so many people taking trees down and then baking in the middle of summer because they didn't think about how much, they took the tree down in the winter, which is great for lumber, but you don't really know because it's cold and you're, screaming for any sunlight. And then come July, you're kicking yourself because you've lost that shade. Think about your replanting. And if your tree removal guy is an arborist, he may have some solutions for you, and certainly could hook you up with somebody who could get you a good species or a sapling or, a more fully grown tree to plant in that place. Take advantage of the nutrients in the root system of that tree that was just felled to give a jump start to a tree that you might plant in memoriam of that 60-year-old oak that you just took down. The next thing is the person who's sawing that tree. Do they maintain a lumber inventory, or do they just saw one log at a time and you take all the lumber back? If they maintain an inventory, you might be able to get a price break. They're essentially buying the log from you, sawing it into boards, and essentially selling back some of that lumber because you said you wanted some of the lumber. Or maybe they give you a credit off the cost of removing the tree and sawing it by giving you X number of board feet back. If the sawyer is just sawing kind of on a consignment basis, one log at a time, and giving you the lumber back, that may not serve your needs, because do you really need that much oak? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. And you might find that it's actually more trouble than it's worth to use that particular sawyer. So in choosing a sawyer, you need to understand, what's the deal? Are you buying this log and keeping the wood, or are you expecting me to take all the wood? And the gray area in between that. Here again, I think there's enough of these guys, once they bought a bandsaw mill, they probably are hoping to sell the lumber. So I don't think you're going to find a lot of examples of a guy that's like, no, I'm sawing it and the lumber is your problem. If that is the case, that may not be the best sawyer you want to seek out, because, well, they may not know what they're doing, and they may not know the best way to saw that log to produce the best yield. Which brings me to the next point. If you have some very specific needs, we're talking oak. Maybe you want quartered. Maybe you're dying to build your entire house Stickley style, and you need quarter sawn oak. Well, that's somebody you need to talk to beforehand. Will they do that? Or will they just through saw? Are they able? Do they have the type of sawmill that will easily flip a cant in order to quarter saw it? Or they have to do that by hand or with a can hook? That will cost a lot more. So it's important for you to understand what you hope to get out of this. And if that's, 6 boards that I can build a chest to remove that tree, that's a good place to start and kind of work backwards from there. So yeah, you might have a tree removal guy already. If he doesn't know a sawyer, I would go find a sawyer first and say, here's what I have. And maybe the sawyer, you might get lucky and the sawyer will say, well, I can take the tree down. Or the sawyer will more than likely say, I know a guy. Because the sawyers, well, they're getting logs from somewhere. They're probably getting it from a tree removal company already, in which case they have a working relationship that's going to make everything go easier. Everybody's going to be happier. They're probably worked out, between the two businesses, how they pay for each other's time. And it's a lot easier on you. Less stress will make the whole thing go, well, easier. And you'll end up with the type of wood that you're looking for. So, like I said, you kind of answered the question of saying you may have to call several people. I agree. You may have to call several people, but there's a little bit more guidance on maybe what you should be asking, what you should be talking about, what you need to be aware of yourself, your expectations, to help you choose the right person. Because the good news is, at least in my neck of the woods, if I look up a mobile sawyer, I have a plethora of options. There are so many people now buying, rubber tire wood misers. And for some reason, I always go to wood miser. You guys have done a good job in your marketing. You're the first name that comes to mind. Any of those mobile bandsaw mills or even non-mobile bandsaw mills, there's a lot of people out there doing them. Heck, there are people with Matt Cremota brand bandsaw mills. They bought the plans and they followed Matt's, they have their own special Matt Cremota bandsaw. There's a lot of you out there, and you'll find that it might be really difficult to choose which one. Hopefully now you've got a few more questions to help you understand what's going to make it easiest, what's going to be best for the life of the tree, for the best lumber yield out of that tree. And the sawyer will have the tree removal sawyer, the lumberjack, will have a better idea of what he needs to do, or she, to remove that log to produce the best lumber. So earlier when I talked about the Alaskan mill, being sawn vertically, because if they drop that large tree, it could shatter it. A guy who doesn't know that you want to saw boards out of that may just drop that tree. He may not use a crane. He may not have a crane, in which case he's probably not the tree removal guy for you. So I hope that helps. Probably gives you a lot to think about, a lot more questions to ask when it comes time to have those trees removed. And again, let me reiterate, if you're having a tree removed, whether it's be sawn into boards, whether the tree's at the end of the life, or unfortunately the tree is infested with something, it's got to come down, or the tree has come down in a storm, think about what you might replant in its place for shade, but also what a great jumpstart to that sapling to be able to tap into an existing root structure. Now, it may not actually physically tap into a root structure like black locust or some of the willows do, but there will be aerated, cultivated, is that the right word? There will be, let's just call it a little biosphere already conducive to tree growth that sapling can take advantage of. And trust me, you'll want that shade back more than anything else. So thank you, everybody, for the great questions. Thanks for tuning in, watching, or listening to the show. I hope you enjoyed it. And please keep those questions coming, lumberupdate.com, or look me up on Instagram at lumberupdateshow. I look forward to your questions, look forward to your feedback, look forward to your show suggestions, everything. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching. And trust me on this. You want to get your hands on some Nara. It's a really cool wood. Till next time, go buy some lumber.